In today's class, we are first going back to 35, well, no, more than that, many years ago, to Eric Wolf's Europe and the People Without History. As I mentioned, for me, the major point of this book was talking about the world of interconnection that happened before there was ever any anthropologists, and how the people outside of Europe also had history and were contributors to this. Wolff also got very into kind of this modes of production from Karl Marx, and talked a lot about production and labor. His final chapter was called The New Laborers. And 35 years ago, when I read this chapter on the new laborers, we all had to write something for each class, a little essay on each class, kind of like I make you write. And I was all into Eric Wolff at the time. And there was this other student in my class who wrote, Wolff talks so much about production. I want to know about reproduction. And I laughed.
Of course you did.
Of course I did, which was so dumb of me. I actually still to this day regret laughing, because this fellow student of mine was correct. Like many bros of the Marxian tradition, Eric Wolff had a huge blind spot. What was the blind spot? What's he not seeing there when he talked? Women. He had a huge gender and sexuality blind spot. Not all of them, but a lot of them, and he probably did more than others. So Anne Stoller, in some ways, is part of this tradition, but did a huge corrective on the blind spot, and is basically saying, this I think is her most famous book, Race and the Education of Desire, subtitled Foucault's History of Sexuality and the Colonial Order of Things. So combining, we'll actually later on in this class read a selection from Foucault's History of Sexuality. That was certainly required reading 35 years ago. But so, she was combining things and talking about how gender and sexuality it wasn't an add-on to colonization. It was central to the mechanism of colonization. And that, one of the main concerns in these colonized areas was the protection of white women from the threat of they were going to be sexually assaulted and raped by the people of color, the colonized. And she says it's not that such incidents did not occur, but the fear of them was out of all proportion to their occurrence. On the other side of this, that, in terms of the men in the colonies, there was no such thing as accusations of rape if they did such things against the colonizer women. So, this is a really important, like I said, an important corrective to the Marxian tradition, and the idea that sexuality and gender are central to colonization and central to our ideas of race is super important. I think what I found also interesting about this is that for the most part, it is, of course, a surveillance of the colonized, trying to keep the colonized in place. But in the interest of the protection of the European women, or it's a supposed interest of the protection of the European women, they get closely surveilled too. In fact, Stoller says that they were nearly as closely surveilled as colonized men. And that, there was, that oftentimes these ideas, the next sentence, while native men were legally punished for alleged sexual assaults, European women were frequently blamed for provoking those desires. And so there were laws passed that it was an offense for a white woman to make an indecent suggestion to a male native. So there was this idea that it was the fault of these white women who were out of line and didn't know how how to behave in this area. Who was particularly dangerous here? What kind of women were dangerous? Unmarried women. Yeah, these single women, they were super dangerous in this situation. They were, professional competence did not leave European women immune from marginalization. Single professional women were held in contempt, as were European prostitutes, with surprisingly similar objections. So, this turns out to be something that is then imposed in this a gendered and racialized and gendered colonial order. Now, I was kind of particularly interested in this reading. To me, this seemed to speak to some of the concerns of today's world. I don't want to get too much into contemporary politics, but I will say that as I was reading through this, it reminded me of a number of accusations that were made about the situation in Gaza and continued to be made about the protection of women, the sexual assault. And to me, it seemed like Stoller's work here is quite relevant to today's situation. And so I was surprised to find so little that we could talk about in terms of how applicable it is, and yet what is actually happening. We couldn't find any video. And so then I went looking for, like I said, Stoller is our first person who is still alive.
Yeah, she's not dead enough.
She is not. She's around. She's still teaching. Yeah, she's teaching. And so I went looking to see what she was up to these days. She seems to have been in Brazil, and she seems to be having a great time. And you could have found a video of her lecture in Brazil, which then got translated, but it's only in like Portuguese. And so if you read Portuguese, you'll see here that it says that she's condemning something of Israel against the Palestinians, and she talks about gender, racism, imperialism. But you have to be able to read Portuguese to know what she's been saying about any of this. And there may be some people who read Spanish in today's world, but very few people have a reading knowledge of Portuguese. It's kind of a obscure, strangely obscure language. Google Translate helped me out here. Yeah, it did a pretty good job. It did a pretty good job, I thought. Not a perfect job. So Stoller says this, but the thing is like very few people know that she says this. First of all, the interview asks if there should be an alternative system. She says a world revolution, and then she laughs. Ha ha ha. And then she asks about limiting people to maybe $5 million or $10 million. Which, I kind of agree with that. Like if you have a billionaire, one person who has $1 billion, that means there could be, instead of that one person with $1 billion, there could be 1,000 people with $1 million, which is better.
Billion.
There you go. So anyway, to me, this is obscene, says Stoller, but governments are complicit with capitalism absolutely everywhere. So yeah, I guess you need that rule. Anyway, she then does talk about Palestine, and she talks about those who are considered subhuman. But like I said, I kind of thought there would be a little bit more. Someone who has talked about the idea of the subhuman brings us to our next reading by Paul Farmer, who has perhaps been one of the people most able to turn our attention to those who have been considered subhuman. Paul Farmer was an undergraduate. He graduated from Duke, and then he went to a hospital in Haiti, and he volunteered there in 1983. He would later get his PhD and an MD in medical ecology from Harvard University at the same time. So he became both a doctor in the medical doctor sense and a doctor in the E sense. While he was there, I'm not sure how he was reading things like, Eric Wolf's book on Europe and the People Without History had come out in 1982. Sidney Mintz was very important as someone who had studied in Haiti and in the Caribbean. And the other thing that was happening at the time in the 1980s, it's hard for you perhaps to imagine what this was like, but there was a mysterious disease that was spreading. And people didn't really know how this disease was transmitted. It was called the 4-H disease. And you were supposed to watch out for homosexuals, hemophiliacs, and heroin users. Yeah, this was HIV. What was the 4th H? Patience. It was called the 4th H. And so what was happening was, again, let's fast forward from there. What was happening was, it seemed in historical retrospect, because of the precarious situation of Haiti at the time, there were a number of people from Haiti who were involved in sex work in Florida. And so this seems to have been a pretty large route of transmission into the United States. But Paul Farmer here was working in Haiti at a time when people started to blame Haitians for AIDS. That was one of his first, I think his first book was called AIDS and Accusation, Haiti and the Geography of Blame. Because what the heck, man? 4-H disease and blaming a group of people for HIV or AIDS. And his other issue, as we talked about, is this idea that the reason why this was happening in Haiti was because of their culture, that maybe they were doing these voodoo ceremonies, or they were, culturally deficient. And so, Farmer was very against this idea of culture being used as a way of blaming people for things that were, in fact, out of their control. And so what Farmer would become most famous for is how a situation of not just culture, but economics and politics and the social situation can result in something that he called structural violence. And so when people think about violence, we often think about individual actions, choices, and things that individuals do. Farmer here was talking about a whole social arrangement. So he says here, structural violence is violence exerted systematically, that is, indirectly, by everyone who belongs to a certain social order. So what he was trying to say here is that in certain economic and political associations, you might not have necessarily individual violence per se, but certain groups get marginalized and over time are subject to this idea of structural violence. So, Haiti was always hugely important in Farmer's work, and he kept going back there. As he notes, Haiti is actually the second independent country in the Americas. The Haitian Revolution began in 1971. France's refusal to accept the loss of so efficient and profitable a colony led ultimately to the expedition of the largest armada ever to cross the Atlantic. So Napoleon ended up setting one of the largest armies ever to try and defeat the Haitians, and they defeated Napoleon's army. It became the first Black-led republic in the world. Actually, something that Clint Smith writes about in his book. This was an unimaginable event for the people at the time, in terms of people did not believe that Africans and enslaved Africans were capable of self-governance. They were, in recognition of their independence, they were saddled with debt or reparations to France, and the US also isolated them, basically refused to recognize them till 1862, in part because the slaveholders of the United States were afraid that something similar might happen. And so the mechanisms of repression were ratcheted up after this. A lot of people don't know this, but Haiti was also occupied by the United States in 1915 for 20 years. As Farmer puts it, now almost completely forgotten by the occupiers. That is us. And he uses a big word to describe what is still happening in terms of what people do to Haiti. What's the word? What does he call it? People give out or don't give out loans or demand terms for extortion, right? Extortion of what they're doing. So, I mean, he's always been a spokesperson, or he was long a spokesperson for some justice and trying to figure out the historical importance of Haiti in the world and trying to explain what is going on. He doesn't mention, but for those of you who've been in my class, I probably have said this. I say this at least once a semester, is that the Haitian Revolution was crucial to US history. Yeah, well, it didn't force him to, but Napoleon was like, who cares now? Once Napoleon lost Haiti, that was like the big moneymaker for him. And so once it was gone, he decided he didn't really need that land over there. And when Jefferson sent some people over to negotiate, I think Jefferson at first just wanted to buy New Orleans, and he's like, have it all for cheap. But this is not something that we learn about in our history books. We learn about the Louisiana Purchase, but we don't learn about how important it was that the Haitian Revolution basically paved the way for this. So, yeah, exactly. In today's world, this connection is perhaps easier to see. I mean, there were some times in various times, there were signs of hope in Haiti, but recently things have been pretty bad. There's a lot of gang-led violence. As you can see from this headline, we have UN appeals for Haiti aid. Humanitarian chief says suffering pain unlike any she's seen. And so, I mean, it's interesting because I see the same things coming out of the United Nations and people who travel who are able to observe and help in Gaza right now are also saying that this is unlike anything they've ever seen. And so we have this curious time in the world in which the work of Paul Farmer and Ann Stoler, I think, are extremely important for understanding these places and understanding our current situation.